the course of the United States history, we have had 44 presidents. And although the president is supposed to be one of the most well-protected men on earth, 4 of them have been assassinated. That's 1 in every 11 presidents. Perhaps the most notable of these 4 men is Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, of course, is admired for liberating the slaves of the South and unifying our divided nation. However, there were those who vilified Lincoln. One of these men was John Wilkes Booth. Booth was Lincoln's assassin and the man whom I will be giving my speech on. Booth is perhaps one of the most evil men in American history. And although he pulled off one of the most daring assassinations in this nation's history, we know so little about him. This has always bothered me, so I chose him as my speech topic. Now, I know I'm not your history teacher, so why listen to me, but having done extensive research in addition to my prior knowledge on this subject, I consider myself a more than reliable source. So, let us continue with my speech on the Civil War assassin, John Wilkes Booth. Now, the early life of Booth. This is something that surprised me. He was part of a theatrical family. He was actually a huge actor of his time, stage actor, of course, not in the real movies. And everyone loved him. He was what you would consider Brad Pitt today, someone that could have shook hands with the president. He was very well loved. But he was from the South, and as most Southerners did, he opposed the Lincoln administration and just wanted Lincoln out of office. He was taking away their kind of life. And actually, before the assassination, Booth had planned with several others to kidnap Lincoln in the 1864 election. This plan never happened, fell through, and on one life. Then came the assassination. They knew they had to get Lincoln out of office. He was already elected along with Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward. They were all supposed to be assassinated, taking out Lincoln's entire administration. That went right down the line. And Booth was in charge of killing Abraham. Now, since he was such a popular actor, he had very easy access to Ford's Theater. It was basically his workplace, so he could travel around freely without anyone telling him, hold up, where are you going? So he could gain easy access to the balcony where Lincoln would be sitting and shoot him. That was his plan. So he snuck up there with a Derringer pistol, 1 shot, put the gun up to Lincoln's head, and before anybody could react, fired the shot, killing him. None of the other assassinations would follow through because the nation was in such ruckus after Lincoln's death, and Johnson and Seward would both get away unharmed. Now here's the details of the murder. After shooting Lincoln, he was accompanied in the balcony, Lincoln was, by Major Henry Rathbone, he and his wife. Now, Rathbone saw Booth, but it was a little too late. Booth already fired the shot. Rathbone just lunged at him, and Booth actually pulled a knife and stabbed Rathbone. Very few people know that. Then Booth proceeded to jump off the balcony, depicted here. That's Rathbone in pain, just got stabbed. And a little bit of irony here, his spur on his boot actually caught the eagle on a U.S. flag, broke his leg, and he fell to the ground. He then ran out into a back alleyway where a horse was waiting for him, and he would ride off. Depicted over here. Now, when he jumped, he shouted out, "Sic semper tyrannis," which means thus always the tyrant. It was the Virginia state motto. This was something shouted by Brutus at Julius Caesar's assassination. Now, the journal entries they found later, John Wilkes Booth compared himself to Brutus a lot. He thought he was doing the nation a favor by getting rid of this tyrant, Abraham Lincoln. Now, we're on to the escape from Ford's Theater. They already had this escape route planned out. He was met up by his friend and fellow conspirator, David Harold. Harold had the horse ordered for him, and as you can see there, Joseph Peanuts, not sure why that's his nickname, Burroughs, was paid to hold the horse for him. He would be arrested and put to death. Booth was met, of course, by Harold. They would ride south into Maryland and hoping to get into Virginia, Southern Territory, where they would hopefully escape. Pursuit. midnight on April 14th, they arrived at Surratt's Tavern. Surratt was an accomplice to Harold and Booth, and there they had a whole bunch of weapons stored from the kidnap plot. They were going to just be armed to the teeth. They would take a couple of the weapons and continue their ride south. They would then stumble upon Dr. Mudd. Now, of course, Booth has a broken leg this whole time. Incredibly painful, and has to be terrible riding a horse like that. Now, of course, Samuel Mudd, Mudd spelled backwards though, which the doctor had no idea of what was going on, and he helped Booth, fixed his leg, and sent him on his way without asking any questions. Booth said he fell from horseback, which may or not be true. They weren't sure if he broke his leg when he fell from the balcony. They would then meet up with a Southern sympathizer, Samuel Cox, and his foster brother, Thomas A. Jones, was a Confederate spy. He would help them by getting them a compass, a map, and a raft that would help them sail across the Potomac into Virginia. Now, this sign right here, they would actually hide out at Samuel Cox's house in the woods for 5 whole days. And the U.S. Army wouldn't find them while they were waiting for that raft to come. On April 21st, they make their trip across the Potomac. However, they make a wrong turn and end up heading north back into Maryland. Complete failure on their part, but luckily, Harold had hunted in this area, and he knew the man owning the land very well, Colonel John Hughes, who was also part of the Confederate Army. They would stay the night there and then finally cross the Potomac successfully into Virginia, where they would be met by William Jett, who takes them to the Garrett farm. So the country reacts. Booth expected at least the South, to love him for this. He would be just honored in all newspapers. Even Southern papers, however, said Booth was a complete moron and this was the stupidest thing anyone could have done. On April 18th, Lincoln's body was brought to the White House, and a mile-long line of people waited outside to mourn over him. These included people like Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, just a whole bunch of people. Rewards were everywhere, including this one here. This is the biggest one set out by the Secretary of War, or Department of War. $100,000. Doesn't seem like a lot, but I translated this into how much it would be today. $2.5 million for these 3 men. Any information, you don't even have to capture them, just information leading to it. One, the capture. Now they're at the Garrett farm on April 24th. But on that same day, Lieutenant Colonel Everton Conger of the Union Army would take a portion of the 16th New York Cavalry Division south, because they have already interrogated William Jett, and he gave up the location of Booth. So they are riding south to the Garrett farm. Booth is unaware of that. By April 26th, Conger's men arrive at the farm, and they are waiting outside. Almost as soon as Conger's men show up, Booth and Harold are awake. They see them coming. Harold immediately opens the barn doors, exit, and surrenders peacefully. He is taken into custody. He will be later put to death. They ask Booth to come out. Booth says, "I'd rather come out and fight." Now, their orders are to take this man alive for interrogation. So they set the barn on fire to scare him out. Now, as soon as they set the barn on fire, Booth realizes it's coming down around him, kicks open the doors, has a gun drawn, and it's confusion, because it was Union soldiers, as to whether he had the gun raised or if he had it pointed at them. Regardless, Sergeant Boston Corbett shot Booth straight through the neck, paralyzing him. Booth would be taken up to the Garrett's porch, and they tried to talk to him, get as much information as they could, but he'd bleed out and die within minutes. Now, there is some controversy to this where it takes a turn, because it is Union soldiers. They may have tried to cover this up. They wanted this to be over with. A lot of people say it was a look-alike, that they shoved another man from the Garrett farm out, because some eyewitnesses from the Garrett farm, not the soldiers, say that the man had a light red hair color. Booth had jet black hair, completely different, and that raised some questions. Also, this is just another tidbit. They try to prove this any way they can. They brought a lot of Booth's loved ones to the autopsy and the identification, And although those people would have known Booth very well, people argue that they said it was Booth, but they were forced to by the Union Army. Booth was brought to Belle Plains by wagon. No big deal. Like, I'm sure he had guards with him, but he was then, once he reached Belle Plains, he was brought aboard the USS Montauk for an autopsy and an identification where they confirmed it was indeed Booth. For years after this, though, this is the aftermath part, the South was absolutely hated for this. Lincoln was a great president, and he was slowly pulling this nation back together, but Booth ended that all with one shot, and the South was hated for that for years to come. Final thoughts. While concluding, I hope that you have learned more about John Wilkes Booth and his notoriety, and why it is so important that we understand about this man. He was one of the most daring, he pulled off the most daring, I believe, assassination in U.S. history, killing one of the most beloved presidents. A nation was almost sewn back together by Lincoln, but Booth shot him in the head and tore it right back apart, ruining all the progress that was made between unifying the South and the North. This makes Booth a pretty important man, and I can't help but wonder why we don't learn about Booth more in our history classes, because those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. I thank you.